James Whitaker slammed the wooden box down on the general store counter so hard that every head in Red Hollow turned. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. He looked around the room at the men who had laughed at him, at the women who had whispered behind his back, and he said quietly, almost gently, "I want to show you something, but only one of you is worth the truth." Then his eyes landed on Clara Bennett, and he didn't look away. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it all started, James Whitaker had been awake since before the sun. That wasn't unusual. James was always awake before the sun. Not because he was ambitious, not because he had a full day of important work waiting for him. At least that's what Red Hollow believed. But because sleep had never come easy to a man carrying the kind of weight James carried. It settled on his chest every night like a stone, and by 3 in the morning, he'd given up fighting it. He'd pull on his boots, the same worn pair he'd had for 4 years. The leather cracked at the left toe, the right heel, worn almost completely flat, and he'd step outside into the cold Colorado darkness and just breathe. That morning in December was no different. Except that it was the morning he decided he was done waiting. He stood outside his cabin at the edge of Red Hollow and looked toward the center of town. The lanterns along Main Street had already been lit by someone early. The bakery was starting its fires. He could smell the wood smoke mixing with cold air. Somewhere a dog was barking at something that didn't matter. Red Hollow was waking up, and James made a decision that would change everything. He went back inside. He moved to the corner of the room, past the small wood stove, past the single chair with the cracked back leg he kept meaning to fix, past the shelf where he kept nothing but a tin cup and a Bible he rarely opened. He crouched down beside the floor, pressed his hand flat against a specific board, and lifted it. Underneath was a wooden box, not large, not fancy, edges smoothed by years of handling, a simple iron latch holding it shut. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up, tucked it under his arm, and walked out the door. By 7 o'clock, James was standing in front of the general store. He didn't go in immediately. He stood on the wooden boards outside, watching the town fill up the way it always did. Men heading to the mill, women walking with baskets, children being pulled along by the wrist, running ahead, being pulled back. Red Hollow was a town that knew itself. Knew its rhythms, knew its people, and it knew James Whitaker. Or it thought it did. "There's that sorry cowboy," said Roy Hatch, loud enough not to care who heard, stepping past James without breaking stride. Roy Hatch ran the feed store and had the particular confidence of a man who'd inherited everything he owned and called it hard work. What's he got under his arm this time? Another one of his schemes. The man walking beside Roy, Ed Carlisle, owner of the hardware, laughed in that easy way. Men laugh when they want to agree without committing to anything. "Don't ask," Ed said, "unless you want to stand there for an hour." Neither of them looked at James directly. That was the thing about being invisible. People talked around you, over you, past you, like you were a post stuck in the middle of the road that everyone had learned to walk around. James watched them go. His jaw was tight, his hands were steady. He pushed open the door of the general store. Inside the store smelled the way it always did, leather and dried herbs, and the faint sweetness of molasses from the barrel near the back window. Old Pete Alderman was behind the counter, spectacles on the end of his nose, tallying something in a ledger. 3 or 4 other townspeople were inside, moving between the shelves, picking things up, setting them down. When James walked in, conversation didn't stop. It changed, lowered, like someone had turned a dial down just slightly. Not enough to be rude, enough to be noticed if you were paying attention. James was always paying attention. He walked to the counter and set the wooden box down. Pete looked up from his ledger, looked at James, looked at the box. "What can I do for you, James?" "Nothing yet," James said. "I need a minute." Pete didn't push. He was one of the few men in Red Hollow who treated James with something close to neutral respect, not warmth, not friendship, but a basic dignity that James appreciated more than Pete probably knew. He went back to his ledger. More people were filtering in now. It was the busiest hour of the morning. Mrs. Carmichael, with her basket. The Devlin brothers arguing about something the way they always argued about everything. Young Tom Hendricks, barely 20, working his first job, running deliveries for the store. And then, Clara Bennett walked in. James noticed her the way he always noticed her, which was to say, he tried not to, and failed completely. Clara Bennett was 27 years old, and had the kind of face that made you feel like she was listening, even when she wasn't looking at you. She wasn't beautiful in the way that stopped conversation. She was beautiful in the way that started it. There was something about her that pulled people in a seriousness behind her eyes that made you want to say something worth hearing. She'd come to Red Hollow 3 years ago after her parents died, bringing her younger sister Margaret with her, taking the schoolteacher position that nobody else wanted because it paid almost nothing, and the schoolhouse needed a new roof, and half the children came to class without shoes. She had stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because she believed the children needed her. James respected that more than anything about her. He also knew she thought he was a nobody. Not unkindly, not cruelly, just the way you know things about the furniture in a room. He was part of the landscape of Red Hollow, the poor cowboy at the edge of town. You walked past him. You nodded sometimes. You didn't wonder about him. Clara walked to the dry goods section and began looking at bolts of cloth, her finger tracing the edge of one with a considering expression like she was running sums in her head. James turned back to the counter. He took a breath. Then he opened the box. The map inside was old. Anyone could see that, just from the color of it, that deep golden brown that paper turned when decades had breathed on it. It was folded carefully, the creases soft from 1,000 foldings and unfoldings. Along the edges the paper had started to feather, and whoever had drawn it, the handwriting was small and precise, had worked with extraordinary care. James unfolded it slowly, set it flat on the counter. Pete Alderman's ledger stopped scratching. Mrs. Carmichael, passing by, paused. One of the Devlin brothers nudged the other. And the room got that particular kind of quiet that a room gets when it hasn't decided yet whether what it's looking at is interesting or absurd. "This is a survey map," James said, not loudly, not performing anything, just stating a fact. "A land survey, original, filed with the Territorial Office in 1863. Pete leaned forward, squinting through his spectacles. "Filed by who?" "My grandfather," James said. "Henry Whitaker." Silence. Then Roy Hatch's voice from somewhere behind James. The man had come back in, apparently, or perhaps had never left Roy Hatch's voice thick with amusement. "Henry Whitaker. Your grandfather was a drunk who died with nothing, James. Everybody knows that." A few uncomfortable laughs. Not everyone, but enough. James didn't turn around. "My grandfather died with a great deal," he said, still looking at the map. "He just made sure nobody knew about it while he was alive. Learned that lesson the hard way." He let that sit for a moment. Then he looked up. He looked around the room slowly at Pete, at Mrs. Carmichael, at the Devlin brothers, at Roy Hatch, at young Tom Hendricks, standing near the back, with his delivery bag still over his shoulder, eyes wide. And then his gaze moved, and landed, and stopped. Clara Bennett had turned from the bolts of cloth. She was looking at him. Not with the polite, forgettable attention of someone waiting for a distraction to pass. She was looking at him the way she looked at things she was trying to understand. James said, "I want to show you something, but only one of you is worth the truth." The room held its breath, and James held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked back down at the map, folded it carefully, placed it back in the box, and latched it shut. "I'll be in front of Pete's store at dawn tomorrow," he said. "Anyone who wants to understand what's been sitting at the edge of your town for 30 years is welcome to come." He picked up the box, tucked it under his arm, and walked out the door. The town, of course, immediately began talking. Roy Hatch said it first because Roy Hatch always said things first. "The man's lost his mind. Someone should check on him." Ed Carlisle. "Poor soul's been out there alone too long." Mrs. Carmichael, in her precise way. "I've always thought there was something peculiar about that man. Not dangerous peculiar, just different." The Devlin brothers bet each other $1 about whether James even had a grandfather. Pete Alderman said nothing. He went back to his ledger, but he wasn't writing anything down. I was staring at the spot on the counter where the map had been. And Clara Bennett went back to the bolt of cloth, ran her finger along the edge of it one more time, and then set it down without buying anything. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "Pete," she said without turning around. "James Whitaker. How long has he been in Red Hollow?" Pete looked up. "Coming on 6 years, I'd say. Maybe 7. "And in all that time, has he ever done anything?" She searched for the word, dramatic, loud, attention-seeking. Pete thought about it. "No," he said finally. "James Whitaker is the quietest man in this county. Keeps to himself. Never starts trouble. Never asks for anything." Clara nodded slowly. "That's what I thought," she said, and she walked out. That afternoon, the temperature dropped sharply the way it did in Colorado in December. The cold came down off the mountains like a hand pressing everything flat. Clara walked home from the store with her coat pulled tight. Margaret trotting alongside her, chattering about something that had happened at school, a boy named Frederick, who had drawn something inappropriate on his slate, the particular outrage of a child who has witnessed injustice. Clara was half listening. She was thinking about James Whitaker's eyes. There was a quality to them that she kept returning to. Not intensity exactly. She'd met intense men, and they always seemed to be straining towards something like a dog pulling at a leash. This was different. This was stillness. The kind of stillness that came not from emptiness, but from fullness, from a man who had more inside him than he was willing to show. "Clara," Margaret said sharper. "Are you listening to me?" "Frederick drew something inappropriate," Clara said. "Yes, I heard." "What are you thinking of?" "Nothing." "You have your thinking face." "I don't have a thinking face, Margaret." "You have exactly a thinking face. Everyone says so. Mrs. Hatch says you look like you're about to argue with someone, even when you're standing perfectly still." Clara almost smiled. Mrs. Hatch is not wrong. They walked in silence for a moment. "Do you know anything about James Whitaker?" Clara asked. Margaret looked up at her. "The sad cowboy." "He's not sad," Clara said more quickly than she intended. "Do you know anything about him?" "He fixed the Petersons' fence last spring when Mr. Peterson hurt his back," Margaret said with the casual authority of a child who absorbs everything happening around her. "And he brought firewood to old Mrs. Garvey 2 winters ago when she couldn't afford to buy it. He didn't tell anyone. Billy Garvey told me because he saw him do it from the upstairs window." Clara stopped walking. "He didn't tell anyone?" "No. Mrs. Garvey tried to thank him at church, and he said he didn't know what she was talking about." Margaret tilted her head. "Do you think that's strange?" "No," Clara said slowly. "I think that's the opposite of strange." That evening she couldn't settle. She tried to grade papers, put them down, made tea, let it go cold, picked up her book, a history of the Western Territories that she'd been working through slowly, and couldn't hold a single sentence in her mind. Finally, she sat at the table in the small kitchen that she and Margaret shared in the small house they rented that was drafty at the north wall, and always smelled faintly of wood smoke, and she thought about what it meant to watch someone closely and see nothing. She had been in Red Hollow for 3 years. She prided herself on knowing people. It was a necessary skill for a teacher to see past the surface behavior to the thing underneath the fear, or the pride, or the loneliness driving it. She was good at it. But James Whitaker had been 6 feet away from her on any number of occasions, and she had never once looked at him. Not really looked. She had seen worn boots, old coat, tired horse. The shorthand that a town assembles around a person and then forgets is just a shorthand. He looks like someone who's carrying a secret. The thought arrived fully formed, and it surprised her because it wasn't her phrasing. It was the way she'd heard one of the store women describe him once dismissively, and she'd filed it away under small-town gossip and never taken it back out. But sitting at her kitchen table in the December cold, she took it back out. And she thought, what if they were right, but wrong about what the secret was? She was at Pete's store before dawn. The street was empty except for a thin layer of frost on the boards and the particular deep blue darkness of the hour before sunrise. Her breath made small clouds. She had her good coat on, the one she saved for church, without entirely examining why. She thought she would be alone. She was not. Old Pete Alderman was there, standing with his hands in his pockets and an expression like a man who has made a decision and is not sure if he's pleased with it. And young Tom Hendricks, who had apparently decided that whatever was happening was more interesting than his delivery route. And to Clara's slight surprise, Mrs. Carmichael, wrapped in a large wool shawl, standing very straight and watching the end of the street. 4 people. Out of an entire town. Clara looked at them. They looked at her. Nobody said anything that would require acknowledgement. Then the sound of a horse on the frozen ground. James Whitaker came out of the darkness at the end of Main Street, riding slowly, the wooden box tied behind his saddle. He was wearing the same clothes he always wore. Nothing had changed about his appearance. But there was something different in the way he held himself. He stopped the horse in front of the store and looked at the small group of them for a moment. His expression was difficult to read. Not surprised exactly, but something close to moved. Like a man who has braced for disappointment and found something else. 4 people, he said quietly. Were you expecting more? Clara asked. I was expecting none, he said. A beat. Then why did you do it? She asked. Why announce it at all? James looked at her. The blue darkness was giving way to the first gray light, and she could see his face clearly now, the lines of it, the weather-worn skin, the eyes that were doing that thing again, that stillness, that was actually depth thing, that had been bothering her since yesterday morning. Because I've been waiting long enough, he said. And waiting alone is its own kind of dying. The words landed quietly. Nobody moved. Then James turned the horse and said over his shoulder simply, Come on then. They rode or walked in Clara's case, and Pete's, the 2 horses carrying James and Mrs. Carmichael, out of Red Hollow as the sun was beginning to show itself along the edge of the mountains. Tom Hendricks walked beside Clara, vibrating with barely contained excitement, clearly fighting the impulse to ask 100 questions. He lost the fight at about the half-mile mark. What do you think is out there? He said in the hushed tone of someone trying to be casual and not achieving it. I don't know, Clara said honestly. You think it's treasure. My dad said James's grandfather was supposed to have found silver. Tom. Somewhere near the Cassidy Range, but nobody believed him because he was Tom. He looked at her. Stop deciding what it is before you get there, she said. That's how you miss the truth when it's right in front of you. He considered this, then nodded with the exaggerated sincerity of a young person absorbing something they half understand. Clara looked ahead at James on his horse. He hadn't looked back once. She had the distinct feeling that he knew exactly who had come without needing to look, that he was the kind of man who had made a practice of knowing everything going on around him while appearing to notice nothing. The kind of man who watches and waits. And she found herself wondering with a force that was almost uncomfortable. What has he been waiting for? They had been walking for about an hour when James stopped at a point where the trail forked, one path continuing west toward the lower valleys, the other climbing sharply north into the mountains. He turned the horse to face them. I need to tell you something before we go further, he said. Everyone stopped. What you're going to see today is something I've kept private for a long time. I've kept it private for reasons that made sense to me. I still believe those reasons were right. He paused. But I also think keeping something hidden too long can do damage, not just to the person who knows, to the truth itself. Pete Alderman cleared his throat. James, what exactly is it that we're going to see? James looked at him. Then his gaze moved inevitably, it seemed to Clara, like something pulled by gravity to her. Something real, he said. Then he turned the horse and took the north path. And something shifted in the air between them, between Clara and this man she had looked at 100 times without seeing something that felt uncomfortably and undeniably like the very first page of something that would take a long time to finish. She followed him into the mountains. The trail north was steep and unfamiliar, and with every step upward, Red Hollow fell further behind its small certainties, its easy judgments, its comfortable picture of who James Whitaker was and was not. Clara climbed, and the cold pressed in around her and ahead of her. The quiet cowboy rode without looking back, carrying his wooden box and his 7 years of silence towards something he had decided it was finally time to share. What she could not have known in that gray December morning was that the secret ahead of her would not be the hardest thing to understand. The hardest thing would be what the secret said about all the things she thought she already knew. The North Trail was not kind to people who weren't used to it. Pete Alderman figured that out about 20 minutes in when his breathing got ragged and he had to stop, hands on his knees, face red as a winter apple. Tom Hendricks, 20 years old and made of something close to rubber, barely noticed the climb. Mrs. Carmichael rode without complaint, though her knuckles on the reins were white enough that Clara noticed. And James. James rode the way a man rides a trail he knows in his sleep, his body moving with the horse like they'd made an agreement years ago about who was in charge of what. Clara walked. She had refused the offer of Pete's horse when Pete stopped to rest it. She didn't explain why. The truth was that walking gave her something to do with the restlessness that had been building in her chest since the moment James had said, "Waiting alone is its own kind of dying," and then turned away, like he hadn't just said the most honest thing she'd heard in 3 years. She put one foot in front of the other, and she thought. She was a woman who had learned early that thinking was its own form of survival. When her parents died, her father first, then her mother, 18 months later, as though her mother had simply decided there was no reason to stay. Clara had been 23 years old, with a 19-year-old sister, and nothing but a small inheritance that wouldn't last 2 years if she let it. She couldn't afford to grieve properly. She could only afford to think. What do we do next? Where do we go? How do we build something that holds? She had thought her way to Red Hollow. She had thought her way through 3 years of teaching children who came to school hungry, of managing a budget that never quite stretched far enough, of being the responsible one, always the responsible one, while Margaret laughed easily and Clara watched and calculated and kept everything upright. Thinking had served her well. But it had also, she was beginning to suspect, taught her to make decisions about people before she'd actually looked at them. She had decided James Whitaker was a poor, struggling cowboy. She had filed him there and never revisited the file. And now she was climbing a mountain in the December cold, because something in her had looked up from the filing cabinet and said, "Wait," ahead of her. James stopped the horse at a flat section of trail and turned. He scanned the group, Pete, who had caught up but was still breathing hard, Tom, who had found a stick somewhere and was using it as a walking staff with tremendous self-satisfaction, Mrs. Carmichael adjusting her shawl. His eyes found Clara last. "How are you doing?" he said, and it was directed at the group technically, but it landed on her. "Fine," she said. "You're favoring your left foot." She was. She hadn't known anyone had noticed. "My boot has a loose nail," she said. "It's nothing." James swung down from the horse in one easy motion. He went to his saddlebag, pulled out a strip of leather, and held it out to her. "Wrap it around the outside," he said. "It'll take the pressure off until we get back." Clara looked at the leather, then at him. "I said it's nothing." "I heard you," he said. "I'm offering anyway." A beat. Tom Hendricks was watching with the unconcealed attention of a young person who has not yet learned to pretend he's not watching. Mrs. Carmichael's expression was carefully neutral. Pete was looking at the mountains. Clara took the leather. "Thank you," she said, and sat on a nearby rock to wrap it, and was annoyed at herself for the fact that her hands weren't entirely steady. James went back to the horse. He didn't make anything of it. He didn't look at her again right away. That somehow was worse. Or better. She couldn't decide. "How much further?" Pete asked. 2 hours if we keep pace," James said. "Maybe less." Pete made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Nobody made you come," Tom Hendricks said helpfully, and Pete gave him a look that should have left a mark. "I came," Pete said with considerable dignity, "because after 30 years of running a store in this town, I have earned the right to know what's been going on at the edge of it." James looked at Pete for a moment. Something moved in his expression quickly, but Clara caught it. Not amusement exactly. More like recognition. Fair enough, James said quietly. And he turned the horse and kept riding. They followed. Clara finished wrapping her boot, tested it. Better. She fell back into step and found when she looked up that Tom Hendricks had dropped back to walk beside her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to either way," she said. He grinned. "Do you trust him?" Clara was quiet for long enough that Tom thought she hadn't heard him. Then she said, "I don't know him well enough to trust him." "But you came." "Yes." "So what's that about then, if it's not trust?" Clara looked ahead at James on his horse, the set of his shoulders, the easy way he carried himself on terrain that should have been difficult. "Curiosity," she said, "and the suspicion that I've been wrong about something." Tom thought about this. "My dad says being wrong is the most expensive thing a person can be." "Your dad is right," Clara said, "which is why it's important to find out as soon as possible." Tom nodded slowly, turning that over. Then, "What do you think you've been wrong about?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the point." They walked in silence for a while. The cold pressed around them, and the trail steepened again, and Clara breathed through it and kept her eyes forward. Then Tom said very quietly, as though he wasn't sure he should say it at all, "He brought food to my family once." Clara glanced at him. Tom kept his eyes on the trail. "2 winters ago, when my dad hurt his leg and couldn't work for 6 weeks, someone left a crate on our porch: flour, salt, pork, dried beans, enough for 2 months. No note. My mom asked around, but nobody claimed it." He paused. "I saw James Whitaker on our street that morning walking away. I never told anyone. I didn't think—" He stopped. "I didn't think it mattered." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "It matters," she said. Tom nodded. But he looked like a young man who was only now understanding the full weight of what he'd just said, and what it meant about all the mornings he'd walked past James Whitaker on Main Street and said nothing. They kept climbing, and the mountain kept its silence around them, the way mountains do when they are waiting for humans to catch up to something they've been holding for a long time. About 40 minutes later, without any warning, James stopped. Not the gradual consulting stop of a man considering the trail. A sudden stop. The horse shifted under him. His head came up. "What is it?" Clara called. "Quiet," he said. Not harsh, just certain. Everyone stopped. The silence rushed in around them, and Clara heard nothing at first, just wind and the creak of leather and her own breathing. Then underneath it something else. A sound that was wrong for the mountain. Too deliberate. Too rhythmic. "Someone's following us," James said. Pete made a sound somewhere between alarm and indignation. "Who would follow us? Get off the trail," James said, already moving the horse to the side into the trees. "All of you, now, don't argue." They didn't argue. They moved quickly into the cover of the pines. Clara pulling Tom by the sleeve because he was still standing in the open, craning his neck to look back down the trail. James swung down, looped the reins around a branch, and stood at the edge of the trees, completely still, watching the trail below them. A minute passed. 2. Then the sound resolved into something recognizable. Footsteps. A horse. 2 riders coming up the trail at a casual pace that was working hard to look casual. Clara, from her position in the trees, could see them clearly enough. She recognized one immediately. Roy Hatch, still wearing the smug expression he'd had in the general store the day before. The man beside him, she didn't know well, a rancher from the south part of the county named Briggs, or Biggs, something like that. A quiet, watchful man with cold eyes that moved constantly, like he was always calculating distances. They rode past slowly. Roy Hatch was saying something in a low voice. She couldn't make it out, but she caught 2 words clearly because they were said with a particular emphasis that turned them into something pointed Whitaker land. Then they were past, continuing up the trail, and the sound of their horses faded. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then James turned back to them. His face was controlled, but there was something underneath it, not fear, but a careful weighing anger. The kind that comes from recognizing a pattern. "They've been watching me," he said simply. "Roy Hatch," Pete said with genuine disbelief. "James Roy's unpleasant, but he's not," He's been watching me for 2 years, James said. Him and the men he works with. I've been expecting something like this. He looked at each of them in turn. This changes things. I need to know right now if any of you have a reason to be connected to Roy Hatch. Business, money, family, anything. Pete looked affronted. I run a general store. Mrs. Carmichael, James said. The older woman met his gaze steadily. My late husband and Roy Hatch had a dispute over water rights 15 years ago, she said with the precision of someone who has never stopped being angry about something. I have no use for that man. Tom. Tom shook his head vigorously. He fired my cousin from the feed store for not working Sundays. James looked at Clara last. His expression was different when he looked at her. She'd noticed this, the slight shift, the way the controlled surface gave a fraction under the weight of looking at her directly. Clara. I've sold him nothing, borrowed nothing, and owe him nothing, she said. I think he's a bully, which I realize is not a helpful observation right now, but it's honest. Something crossed James's face. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more real. That's honest, he agreed. He turned and began untying the horse's reins. Then stay close. And if they double back, let me handle it. Handle it how? Clara asked. He looked over his shoulder at her. Calmly, he said. And somehow, from him, that word carried more weight than a threat. They came back to the trail and kept going. But the air had changed between them. Now the comfortable distance of 5 strangers on an unexplained errand, replaced by something more charged, more real. Someone else knew about this journey. Someone had decided it was worth following. And that meant whatever was at the end of it was worth more than any of them had imagined. Clara watched James's back as he rode, and thought about Roy Hatch saying Whitaker land in that weighted, deliberate way. Not James's land. Not that poor cowboy's little cabin. Whitaker land. Like it was a known thing. A significant thing. A thing worth following a man up a mountain in December to get closer to. She thought about the map in the wooden box. She thought about James's grandfather. She thought about a man who had chosen to live as nothing when he was something, and the very particular kind of intelligence it took to do that for years without breaking. And she felt something settle in her that wasn't quite awe and wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. She kept walking. An hour and a half into the climb, the trail leveled out unexpectedly, opening into a wide, flat stretch where the wind came at you from 3 sides, and the sound of it was a constant low roar that you had to speak over if you wanted to be heard. James stopped here and got down from the horse. He turned to face all of them, and his expression had changed again. Whatever calculation he'd been doing while he rode, he'd finished it. I need to tell you something, he said. About what we're going to. Not what it is, you'll see that. But why I kept it hidden. Nobody interrupted him. James looked at the wooden box tied to his saddle. He was quiet for a moment, and Clara had the sense of a man choosing words the way you choose which boards to step on, crossing a rotten floor carefully because the wrong choice puts you through. When I was 22 years old, he said, my grandfather died and left me everything he had, which was more than anyone knew because he was a careful man who'd been careful his whole life. He'd built something real, worked for it honestly over 40 years. He paused. And within 6 months of me inheriting it, I had 17 new friends I'd never met before. Business partners who were certain we had mutual interests. A woman who was very sure she'd loved me for a long time. Cousins I didn't know I had. His mouth tightened. And a lawyer who helped 2 of those new friends drain a significant portion of what my grandfather left through a contract I was too young and too trusting to read correctly. Silence. Tom Hendricks's face had gone through several expressions in quick succession, landing on something like horrified. Mrs. Carmichael's expression hadn't changed, but her hands had tightened on the reins. Pete Alderman was looking at James with the expression of a man who is recalculating something important. Clara said nothing. She watched James's face and thought he is telling us the most painful thing he knows how to tell, and he's telling it like it happened to someone he used to know. That distance is not coldness. That distance is armor. I got most of it back, James continued. Took 3 years. Cost me a great deal of things that money didn't replace. He looked at his hands for a moment. After that, I decided I needed to know what I was worth without the ranch, who I was when I had nothing to offer anyone. So I came to Red Hollow with worn-out boots and a tired horse and a story about being broke, and I have been very careful to stay broke-looking ever since. A beat. Then Pete Alderman said in a voice that was strangely fragile for a man of his particular solidity. For 7 years. 6.5, James said. And the ranch has been running without me, James said. Managed by a man named George Aldine, who I've known since I was 15 and who I trust completely. It's done well. I've checked on it. I've never left it for long. He met Pete's eyes. I just never let Red Hollow know I had anything worth checking on. Another silence. A longer one. This was the moment Clara had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it. The moment when the picture she'd had of James Whitaker in her mind was replaced by something she hadn't drawn herself, something that didn't fit any of the shapes she'd been using. But what she felt wasn't what she expected to feel. She'd expected to feel impressed. Maybe a little foolish for not having seen it. Instead, she felt something sharper. "Why are you telling us this now?" she said. James looked at her. "Because Roy Hatch found out 3 months ago," he said. "I don't know how. Someone talked. Someone always talks eventually." He paused. He's been trying to find the ranch since then. To file a competing claim on a section of the Northland that borders his property. There's a water source there. He wants it. Pete said, "Can he do that? File a competing claim? If the original documentation is challenged, yes, which is why the map matters." James touched the wooden box briefly. "My grandfather's original survey. If I can get it recorded with the county surveyor, it closes the challenge permanently." "And you've been sitting on it," Clara said slowly, "for 6.5 years." "I wasn't in a hurry," James said, "until Roy Hatch started following you." "Until Roy Hatch started following me," he agreed. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Several things were true at once, and she was working through them in the way she worked through things methodically, without flinching from the ones that were uncomfortable. True, James Whitaker was not who Red Hollow thought he was. True, he had good reasons for what he'd done. True. Those reasons included being betrayed by people who discovered what he owned. And then the thing that was sharpest, the thing that pressed most directly, true, he had chosen to show the map in public, in the general store, in front of everyone. And then his gaze had gone across the whole room directly to her. Not Pete, not Mrs. Carmichael, not Tom Hendricks. Her. "One question," she said. James waited. "Yesterday, in Pete's store. You looked at me when you said only one person was worth the truth." She kept her voice steady and her eyes direct. "Why me?" The wind pushed around them. Tom Hendricks appeared to have stopped breathing. James held her gaze for a long, unhurried moment. "Because," he said, "in 6.5 years, you're the only person in Red Hollow who has never once looked at me like I had nothing to offer." The words fell into the wind and the cold and the silence, and sat there. Clara felt the ground shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the trail. "I look at everyone the same way," she said, and even as she said it, she knew it wasn't quite the argument she intended it to be. "I know," James said simply. "That's why." Then he untied the box from the saddle, tucked it under his arm, and said over his shoulder, with the calm certainty of a man returning to business, "We should keep moving. We're losing this morning." And he walked forward. And Clara followed him, because what else do you do when the ground has just shifted and the only direction that makes sense is the one that was already open in front of you? They moved. Pete fell in beside Mrs. Carmichael, and the two of them had a conversation in low tones that Clara wasn't close enough to hear. Tom walked just behind Clara, and she could feel him vibrating with the effort of not saying anything, which she appreciated. Then Tom inevitably said something. "That was," he started. "Tom." "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'm not saying anything." He lasted about 90 seconds. "But did you notice the way he—" "Tom." "Right," he said. "Right, absolutely." Clara almost smiled. They came roughly 20 minutes later to a place on the trail where James stopped again. This time, not because of sounds behind them. This time, because of what was ahead. He looked back at the group. His expression was different now. Whatever he'd been carrying for the past hour had settled into something calmer. Resolved. Like a man who has been standing outside a door for years and has finally put his hand on the knob. "Before we go over this ridge," he said, "I want to say one more thing." They gathered around him. The wind had dropped slightly here, and the quiet felt expectant. "I have spent 6.5 years testing something," James said. "Testing whether a man's character is enough. Whether that's what people see first or last or at all." He looked at each of them. The answer Red Hollow gave me for a long time was that it wasn't. That without something to show for yourself, you don't get the benefit of the doubt. He paused. "The 4 of you came this morning. I want you to know what that means." Pete Alderman made a small, uncomfortable sound that might have been emotion and might have been the altitude. Mrs. Carmichael looked at a point just past James's left shoulder with an expression of great composure. Tom Hendricks looked like he was going to cry, which he was young enough that it was fine. Clara looked at James directly and said nothing, because she had learned long ago that sometimes looking directly at someone and saying nothing is the most honest thing you can do. James gave a short nod. Then he turned and walked to the ridge. And when he stopped there and turned back to them, and when the 4 of them came to stand beside him and looked out at what was below, Clara's breath left her body in a single silent rush. There was no way to be prepared for it. Not the size of it, or the order of it, or the deep thriving aliveness of it. There it was hidden in the valley between the mountains. Exactly as though the mountains had decided to keep it for themselves, and had done a very good job of it for a very long time. And Clara stood at the top of the ridge in the December cold, and understood all at once several things simultaneously. She understood why he had hidden it. She understood why Roy Hatch wanted it. She understood why the map in the wooden box mattered more than anyone in Red Hollow had been able to guess. And she understood with a clarity that was almost physical, that hit her somewhere behind the sternum, that the man standing beside her, the man everyone in Red Hollow had looked at every day and decided was nothing, had been carrying all of this in silence for 6.5 years and had never once asked anyone to look at him differently. He had just waited for someone who would look at him right. She turned to say something. She didn't know what, yet the words hadn't caught up to the feeling. But when she turned, she found that James was already looking at her. Not at the valley, at her. Watching her face the way someone watches a face when the answer they've been waiting for is written there, and they're finally, after a very long time, close enough to read it. And Clara Bennett, who had thought her way through everything that had ever happened to her, who had survived by thinking and planning and never being caught. Surprised, Clara stood on that ridge in the cold mountain wind and could not, for the first time in years, think of a single thing. She could only feel. And what she felt was the particular terrifying recognition of standing at the exact beginning of something you cannot undo. Behind them, faint but real, came the sound of horses on a trail. 2 horses, coming up from below. James heard it at the same moment she did. She saw his jaw set. "Roy Hatch," he said quietly, and his voice had taken on a new quality, not anger, not fear, but the focused, exact stillness of a man who has been expecting this and is entirely ready. He looked at Clara. "Whatever happens next," he said, "I need you to remember something." "What?" she said. He held her gaze. "The map is real," he said. "Everything I told you is real. Whatever he says, whatever he's come here to say, don't let it make you doubt that." It was not a plea. It was a man who had been lied to and about for years and years by people with beautiful reasons, asking one person to hold on to something true. Clara held his gaze. "I won't," she said, and she meant it with every precise, careful thinking part of her. She meant it the way you mean things when you have finally stopped calculating and started simply knowing. The sound of the horses grew closer. James turned to face the trail. And the morning, which had already turned over more truth than most years contained, prepared to turn over one more. Roy Hatch rode up to the ridge like a man who had rehearsed this moment, That was the first thing Clara noticed. The way he sat on the horse, too straight, too easy, the casualness of someone performing casualness. The man beside him. Briggs said nothing, and kept his eyes moving the way they had on the trail below, that constant calculating sweep that made Clara's skin prickle. Roy looked at James, then at the valley below, then back at James. He smiled. "Well," he said, "there it is." James said nothing. Roy swung down from his horse, slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he wants everyone watching to know he's not in a hurry. He walked to the edge of the ridge and stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, looking down at the valley with an expression that Clara could only describe as ownership, not what he had, but what he intended to have. "You know," Roy said conversationally, like they were all standing around Pete's stove on a cold afternoon. "I always knew there was something out here. Always. Your grandfather had that look about him. Men who found something real, they carry it different." He turned to look at James. "You carry it the same way." "Roy," James said, "whatever you've come to say it." Roy tilted his head. The smile stayed. "I came to say that I've already spoken to Judge Patterson about the North Boundary claim. Filed the paperwork last week." He reached into his coat, and every person on that ridge tightened all at once the way people tighten when a hand goes into a coat and they don't know what's coming out, and produced a folded document. Biggs here witnessed it, legal and proper. He held it out. James didn't take it. "A filed claim isn't a granted claim," James said. "No," Roy agreed pleasantly. "But a disputed claim goes to hearing, and hearings take time, months sometimes. And while a claim is under dispute, the land in question can't be developed, sold, or used as collateral." He paused, letting that settle. "How long can you afford to wait?" James running a spread this size without access to capital. It was well constructed. Clara had to give him that, even as something in her chest turned cold on James's behalf. Roy Hatch was not a smart man in the way that learned men were smart, but he was the particular kind of clever that came from spending a lifetime finding other people's soft spots. James was quiet for a moment. His face gave nothing away. Then he said, "Is that all?" Roy blinked. He'd expected something different. Defense, maybe. Or anger he could use. The smoothness slipped for just a half second before it came back. "No," he said. "I have a proposal." "I'm not interested in your proposal." "You haven't heard it." "I don't need to," James said. "You want the north section, the water source. You've always wanted it. You approached my grandfather about it 20 years ago, and he turned you down, and you've been waiting since then for the right moment." He met Roy's eyes. "This isn't the right moment either." The smile finally left Roy Hatch's face, and what was underneath it was not anger. It was something colder. The expression of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has decided to stop being patient. "Your grandfather," Roy said, "made enemies when he didn't need to. Stubborn old man. I offered him fair value." "You offered him a quarter of fair value," James said. "He kept records." "A beat." "So do I," Roy said softly. The two men looked at each other across the cold morning air, and Clara understood watching them that this was not a new conversation. This was a very old conversation, reaching its final chapter, and everything that had brought them all to this ridge. The wooden box, the map, the December journey. The four people who had shown up at dawn was part of the same long story that had started long before any of them were standing in it. Pete Alderman cleared his throat. "Roy, I've known you going on 20 years. Roy looked at him as though registering his presence for the first time. "Whatever you filed," Pete said, "and whatever you intend, I'm going to say this plainly. There are 4 witnesses standing on this ridge who have heard James state his claim clearly and show documentation in good faith. I keep records too. 30 years of transactions in this county. I know every man who's ever done business with you." He paused. "Don't make this something it doesn't have to be." Roy looked at Pete for a long moment. Then at Mrs. Carmichael, who returned his gaze with the particular iron composure of a woman who had outlasted a difficult husband and was entirely unimpressed by difficult men in general. Then at Tom Hendricks, who was young enough to be frightened, but was holding his ground with the determined expression of someone deciding what kind of man he was going to be right now in real time. Then Roy looked at Clara, and something shifted in his face, something calculating. "Miss Bennett," he said with a courtesy that was not courtesy at all. "You're a practical woman. Everyone says so. You're raising a younger sister on a school teacher's salary, which I respect, I do." He paused. "How much do you actually know about this man? He's been lying to this town for 6 years. Everything you think you know about his character was built on a performance. Doesn't that trouble you?" Clara felt every eye on the ridge move to her. She took a breath. "What troubles me," she said, "is a man who follows people up a mountain to make threats and then tries to dress it up as conversation." She kept her voice level. "You asked what I know about James Whitaker. I'll tell you what I know. I know he fixed a fence for a neighbor who couldn't pay him. I know he left firewood on the porch of a widow who couldn't afford it and never told a soul. I know that when he had the choice to be impressive, he chose to be honest instead, which in my experience is the rarer and harder thing." She looked Roy Hatch directly in the eye. "I know enough." Silence. Roy held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at James, and the pleasant performance was gone entirely, now replaced by something that had dropped any pretense of being anything other than what it was. "You have 30 days, Roy said. "Get the documentation to the surveyor's office. If it's not filed and verified in 30 days, my claim stands, and we'll let the courts sort out what's whose." He turned, walked back to his horse, and mounted. Briggs had never spoken a single word. He turned his horse and followed. They rode back down the trail without looking back. The ridge was quiet for a long moment after the sound of the hooves faded. Then Tom Hendricks said, exhaling, "He can actually do that, file a claim like that." "He already did," James said. His voice was controlled, but Clara was close enough now to hear something underneath it. Not fear, but the sound of a man absorbing a hit and calculating what it means. "The question is whether my documentation holds." "Will it?" Mrs. Carmichael asked. James looked at the wooden box in his hands. "It should. If I can get it to the county surveyor in Hartwell before the 30 days are up." He paused. "Hartwell is 4 days' ride." "Then you should leave soon," Pete said. "I should leave today," James said. Everyone went quiet in, recalibrating. The easy unfolding quality of the morning, strange and revelatory as it had been, was replaced by something more urgent, the particular atmosphere of a situation that has just declared itself a problem requiring action. Clara was already thinking. She could feel the familiar mechanism of it clicking into place, the part of her that didn't panic, that just assessed and moved. "The map," she said. "Let me see it." James looked at her. "Why?" "Because you need to know if the documentation is sound before you ride 4 days to Hartwell and find out it isn't." She held out her hand. "My father was a surveyor. I grew up reading these documents. Let me look at it." A beat. James looked at her hand, then at her face. Something moved through his expression, that same quality she'd seen the very first time she'd actually looked at him. That stillness, that was depth. And then he opened the box. He handed her the map. Clara unfolded it carefully, holding it flat against the cold wind with both hands. She looked at the way she looked at things she needed to understand thoroughly, without rushing, her eyes moving across the paper in the systematic way her father had taught her when she was 9 years old, and he was explaining that land didn't lie, but documents about land could, and knowing the difference was the most important skill a person could have in a new country. The others gathered around her close enough to look far enough to give her room. She went through it. Section markers. Boundary descriptions. The survey date 1863, as James had said, which predated Roy Hatch's family's arrival in the county by at least a decade. The surveyor's seal still clear. Her father had told her what to look for. Consistency in the measurements. The relationship between fixed landmarks and boundary lines. The integrity of the seal, and most critically, the registration notation in the corner that indicated whether the survey had been filed with the territorial office. She found the notation. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up. "This was filed," she said. "There's a registration number. You can cross-reference it against the territorial records." She refolded the map carefully. If those records are intact, Roy Hatch's claim has no foundation. The north section has been legally documented as Whitaker land since 1863. James let out a breath. It was the first uncontrolled thing she'd seen him do. The territorial records, Pete said. Are they in Hartwell? They should be, Clara said. The territorial office kept copies of everything filed between 1860 and 1880. Unless... She stopped. James looked at her. Unless what? She met his eyes. Unless someone has already gotten to them. The thought landed on all of them at the same moment. Roy Hatch had been planning this for 3 months by James's own account. A man who planned carefully enough to follow someone up a mountain and file a legal challenge with a county judge that was a man who thought ahead. That was a man who would have considered the documentary trail. I need to ride today, James said. He was already moving toward his horse, the box secured back under his arm, his mind clearly several steps ahead of his body. Right now, James. Clara's voice stopped him. He turned. She was looking at him with an expression that she knew was readable. She'd never been good at hiding what she was thinking. It was her most persistent professional liability, and what it said was, I am about to say something that surprised me before it surprised you. I'm coming with you, she said. The silence that followed was specific and loaded. Tom Hendricks physically turned to look at Pete Alderman. Pete Alderman appeared to be studying the horizon. Mrs. Carmichael's expression suggested she found this entirely unsurprising. James looked at Clara for a long moment. Clara, he said with the particular careful tone of a man choosing words again. Hartwell is 4 days. I know how far Hartwell is. Margaret. Margaret is 19 years old and fully capable of managing 4 days without me. She's been telling me that for a year. Clara held his gaze. I can read the territorial documents. You might get to Hartwell and find something in the records that needs interpreting. Something contested or partial. You'll need someone who knows what they're looking at. I can read a survey document. Can you read a territorial registrar's cross-reference notation from 1863 in the handwriting of a clerk who apparently never heard of legibility? She tilted her head slightly. Because I can. A beat. That's a practical argument, James said. Yes, Clara agreed. It is. Another beat. Is that the only reason? He asked quietly. The question was direct and honest and deserved a direct and honest answer. Clara felt the real question behind the practical question, the thing he was actually asking. She thought about lying. It would have been easy. She was a practical woman. Everyone said so. No, she said. It's not the only reason. James held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Something in his face, in those careful, deep eyes moved, shifted, made room for something it had been holding at a careful distance. Then he looked away. We ride in an hour, he said. You'll need to send word to Margaret. Clara nodded, and that was that. They rode back down the mountain. All 5 of them, in a configuration that felt subtly different from the one that had come up weighted with everything that had happened on the ridge. Pete Alderman was quiet, in a way that meant he was thinking hard. Mrs. Carmichael spoke once to say that she had a nephew in Hartwell and would send a telegram ahead so that James and Clara had somewhere safe to stay. She said this without inflection, as though it were ordinary, and moved on before anyone could make anything of it. Tom Hendricks rode beside James for a stretch and said eventually, Mr. Whitaker. James looked at him. When you get back, Tom said. I'd like to, if you need men on the ranch, people you can trust. I work hard. My father can vouch for me, and Pete can vouch for my father. He said it quickly, with the rehearsed quality of something he'd been building up to for most of the descent. I'm not asking because of what I saw up there. I'm asking because of what I already knew about you. Before today. James studied the young man for a moment. What did you know about me before today? He asked. Tom looked at his hands on the reins. That you left food on our porch, he said. 2 winters ago. I never said anything. I should have. He met James's eyes. I should have said something a long time ago. James was quiet for a moment that held more inside it than most conversations. You're saying something now, James said finally. Tom nodded. I'll remember that, James said. They rode the rest of the way down in a silence that was not empty but full. The kind of full that comes after things have been said, that can't be unsaid when the air is still adjusting to the new shape of things. Back in Red Hollow, they separated with the efficiency of people who have a plan and a deadline. Pete went to send telegrams. Mrs. Carmichael went home to write to her nephew. Tom went to find his father. James went to prepare for the ride. Clara went home to Margaret. Margaret was in the kitchen when Clara came through the door, sitting at the table with papers spread around her lesson plans, Clara realized, for the school. She'd been covering for Clara without being asked. She looked up. She took one look at her sister's face and said, "What happened?" Clara sat down across from her and told her. All of it. The map, the Mountain Roy hatch on the ridge, the 30-day deadline, Hartwell. She left out only the small specific unnamed thing that had happened when she'd said, "I'm coming with you." And James had asked, "Is that the only reason?" And she had said no. That she kept for now in the part of herself that wasn't ready to explain it yet. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Margaret, who had opinions early and often. When Clara finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're going to Hartwell?" "Yes." "With James Whitaker?" "Yes." "The man everyone thought was bull, Margaret." I know. Margaret leaned back in her chair. She was quiet again for a moment. Then carefully, "Clara, are you all right?" Clara looked at her sister. Really looked the way she didn't always make time to do, because Margaret was usually fine, and there was always something else requiring attention. Margaret at 23 had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and her own particular warmth that Clara had sometimes in her more honest moments suspected she herself lacked. "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "I think I've been looking at things wrong for a while, not just him, other things too." Margaret held her gaze. "That's not a comfortable feeling," Margaret said. "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't." Margaret was quiet for another moment. "He's a good man," she said then simply. Clara looked at her. "You don't know him." "Billy Garvey's mother talked about him at church for a month after he left that firewood," Margaret said. "I know enough." She tilted her head in the same way Clara did when she was considering something carefully. "And I think you know enough too. You just haven't decided what to do about it yet." Clara stood up. She had packing to do and a timeline to meet and approximately 400 things to organize before she could leave, which was the reliable comfort of practicality. There was always something that needed doing, which meant you never had to sit still long enough to be frightened of what you were walking toward. "I'll be back in 5 days," she said. "Maybe 6. "I'll manage," Margaret said. "I know you will." Clara paused at the doorway. "Margaret." "Yes. Thank you, for the lesson plans, for being capable. I don't say that enough." Margaret smiled the wide, unguarded smile that she'd had since childhood. "You say it in other ways," she said. "Go, don't be late." Clara went. An hour and 10 minutes later, she was standing in front of Pete's store, with a packed bag and a coat that was better suited to long riding than the church one she'd worn that morning. James was already there, horse-ready, saddlebags full. He looked at her pack, assessed it the way he assessed everything quickly without comment, and nodded. "You travel light," he said. "I've had practice," she said. They started to ride. The first hour was quiet, in the way that two people are quiet when they are used to managing themselves and haven't yet established the particular shorthand of managing themselves together. Clara rode and thought. James rode, and she suspected thought. The horses moved at a pace that ate up the miles without rushing, and the afternoon light shifted around them. At a bend in the trail where a stream crossed, and the horses needed a moment to drink, James stopped. I was looking at the trail ahead, but Clara had the sense he was seeing something else. The set of his jaw had that quality again, working through something internal without showing the work. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said without looking at her. "The woman," she said carefully. "The one you mentioned. The one who was certain she'd loved you for a long time when your grandfather died." She kept her voice neutral, factual, the way she spoke when she wanted to understand something rather than make a point. "What happened to her?" James was quiet for a moment. The horses drank. "She married the lawyer," he said. Clara absorbed this. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "She did me a favor." He looked at her, then sideways briefly. "I spent a long time being angry about it. Then I spent a long time being grateful. It's strange the things you end up grateful for." Clara thought about her parents. The quick grief, the insufficient time for it. The years of holding everything together with both hands. "Yes," she said quietly. "It is strange." A beat. "Clara," he said. "Yes. Whatever we find in Hartwell." He stopped, started again. "I want to be clear about something. I didn't ask you to come. I wouldn't have. Not because I don't—" He stopped again, and the slight roughness in his voice was the most unguarded she'd heard him, and she held very still, because she had the feeling that one wrong move would close it back up. "Because I don't want you to think that what I said on the mountain about looking at me differently, I don't want you to feel that I'm asking you to do anything about that." Clara looked at him. "James," she said. He looked back at her. "I'm a woman who has made her own decisions since she was 23 years old," she said. "I came because I chose to come. Not because you asked. Not because I felt obligated. Because I chose." She held his gaze. "Give me the credit of my own choices." Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Not the way things changed in stories where the change was large and sudden. Just a small quiet shifting like a door that has been closed for a long time being opened an inch. Enough to let the air through. All right, he said. "All right," she said. They rode. 2 hours later, at the last light of the afternoon, they stopped at a farmhouse where James clearly knew the family, a couple named Harrison, weathered and warm, who took their horses without asking questions and set 2 places at the table without being asked. The husband, Frank Harrison, poured coffee and sat across from James and said, with the directness of a long friendship, "I heard Roy Hatch was sniffing around your place." "He was doing more than sniffing," James said. Frank Harrison's expression darkened. "What do you need?" "Nothing tonight," James said. "We're heading to Hartwell, but if anyone comes asking about my movements in the next week—" "Nobody came by," Frank said immediately. "I haven't seen anyone." James looked at him. "Frank?" "James." Frank Harrison set down his cup and met his eyes with the absolute steadiness of a man who has decided something simple and clear. "Nobody came by." James held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," he said. Clara watched this exchange and felt something settle in her chest. Something that she recognized slowly as the particular relief of discovering that a man's word about himself is backed up by the way other people speak to him. Roy Hatch had called James a liar, a performer, a man whose character was a costume. But Frank Harrison had heard James was in trouble and said nobody came by before James even finished the sentence. That was not a transaction. That was loyalty. And loyalty was not given to performances. She drank her coffee, and she watched James talk to Frank and his wife Ruth, and she saw in the ease of it the warmth underneath the quietness, a version of him that Red Hollow had never been allowed to see. A man who was known and trusted and cared for by people who had no reason to pretend. And she thought Red Hollow has been living next to this man for 6 years and has no idea what they had. And then with the sharp precision that was her particular gift, neither did I. After supper, Ruth Harrison showed Clara to a small room with a narrow bed and a quilt that smelled of cedar and age. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and took off her boots and sat in the quiet for a moment. Through the wall she could hear James and Frank talking. Low voices. The particular cadence of 2 men who had known each other long enough to speak in half sentences. She couldn't make out words, but at one point she heard James laugh, a real laugh. Brief and genuine, nothing like the controlled quiet he maintained in Red Hollow, and the sound of it moved through the wall and settled over her with a weight she hadn't expected. She lay back on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. She was 4 days from Hartwell. 30 days from a deadline that could cost James everything his grandfather built. In a farmhouse she'd never been to, having followed a man she'd filed away as nobody for 3 years now, riding beside him towards something she could not yet fully see. She thought Margaret was right. "I know enough. And then more quietly, the thing she hadn't let herself think yet. I think I've known enough for longer than today. In the other room, James stopped talking. A door closed softly. Silence. Clara closed her eyes. And outside, the Colorado night settled around the farmhouse, cold and clear and enormous, and somewhere in the dark ahead of them, Hartwell waited with its records and its truth, and whatever Roy Hatch had or had not already done to both. And somewhere behind them, Red Hollow slept without knowing that the man it had dismissed for 6 years was riding toward something that would change everything, not just for him, but for every person who had stood outside his door and decided without looking that there was nothing worth seeing inside. They rode out before sunrise. Frank Harrison was already up when they came through, the kitchen coffee on the stove, 2 wrapped portions of cornbread on the table. He said nothing about the early hour. He just handed James a leather canteen and gripped his shoulder once, the way men do when words are both unnecessary and insufficient, and then stepped back. Ruth Harrison caught Clara's hand at the door. "He's a good man," she said quietly. Not as information, as confirmation of something she assumed Clara already knew. "I'm beginning to understand that," Clara said. Ruth looked at her with the particular assessment of a woman who has seen enough of life to recognize when something is just beginning. "Don't take too long," she said simply. Then she let go of Clara's hand and went back to the stove. They rode into the gray pre-dawn cold, and for the first mile, neither of them spoke. The silence between them had changed since the night before. It was no longer the silence of strangers managing themselves carefully. It had become the silence of 2 people who have said enough real things that the quiet between them now has content, weight, shape. Clara broke it first. "How long have the Harrisons known you?" 12 years, James said. "Frank worked my grandfather's ranch for 6 of them. He's the one who told me after the business with the lawyer that I needed to go away for a while, that staying and fighting wasn't the same thing as winning." He paused. He was right. "He seems like a man who usually is. He has his moments of being completely wrong," James said, and there was a dryness in it that Clara recognized as the particular humor of people who don't perform humor, who let it arrive naturally when it does. She found she liked it considerably. "What was he wrong about?" she asked. James glanced at her sideways. "He told me Red Hollow was a good place to disappear. He said small towns didn't notice things." Clara thought about 6.5 years of being the poor cowboy at the edge of town. "He wasn't entirely wrong," she said. "We noticed you. We just didn't see you." That's a careful distinction. It's an important one. James was quiet for a moment, and she felt him considering that, turning it over, the way he turned everything over, not quickly, not carelessly. "You're right," he said. "It is." They rode on, and the sky began its slow conversion from black to deep blue to the first thin gray of morning, and Clara pulled her coat tighter and thought about the difference between noticing and seeing, and how much of her life she'd spent doing the former when she should have been doing the latter. By midday, they'd covered significant ground, pushing at a pace that the horses handled well. They stopped briefly at a creek to water the animals and eat the cornbread Ruth had packed, sitting on opposite sides of the bank without discussion, as though the space was an agreement they'd both made without negotiating it. It was James who broke this silence. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You asked me that yesterday," Clara said. "I said yes then. I'll say yes now." Something crossed his face. "Why did you really stay in Red Hollow?" Clara looked at the water. It was a question she had answered many times in the version she gave other people. The children needed her. The school needed her. Margaret needed stability. All true. All partial. "Because leaving felt like admitting I couldn't make something work," she said. "And I have never been good at that." "Is that stubbornness?" "My father called it tenacity," she said. "My mother called it stubbornness. I've been negotiating between those 2 words for years." James looked at her with that quality she'd come to recognize as his particular form of attention, full and quiet, and entirely without performance. "What do you call it?" she considered. "Necessary," she said. "It's been necessary. Whether it's a virtue or a flaw depends on the day." "Most things are like that," he said. "Yes," she agreed. Most things are. They ate their cornbread and watered their horses and rode on, and the afternoon passed in a rhythm that Clara found herself settling into the movement of the horse, the cold air, the conversation that came and went naturally without the forced quality of people trying to fill silence. James talked when he had something to say. He was quiet when he didn't. Clara matched him and found that it was remarkably easy, and that the ease of it was remarkable precisely because she had not expected it. That evening they stopped at a small way station run by a taciturn man named Cole, who charged a fair price for a stall and a meal, and asked no questions. They ate at opposite ends of the small common room, but Clara caught James watching her once, not in the way that made her uncomfortable, but in the way a person watches something they're still trying to understand, and when their eyes met, he didn't look away quickly the way people did when they were caught. He simply held her gaze for a moment, and then looked back at his coffee, and the steadiness of it made something in her chest do something she decided not to examine too closely. She slept better than she expected. Day 3 brought rain. Not the gentle winter rain that you could ride through without much difficulty, but the hard-driving Colorado rain that came off the mountains sideways and found every gap in your coat and made the horses miserable and the trail uncertain. They rode through it for 2 hours before James pulled them under the overhang of a rock formation, wide enough to shelter both horses and both riders. They stood close together in the dry space arms, almost touching, watching the rain come down in gray sheets, and Clara was acutely aware of how much space wasn't between them. "This could last an hour," James said, "or 4. "Then we wait," Clara said. They waited. For a while neither spoke. The rain was loud enough that conversation required effort, which made silence the natural choice. But then James reached into his saddlebag and brought out the wooden box, and Clara looked at him. "I want you to look at it again," he said. "There's something I didn't show you on the mountain, something I haven't shown anyone." Clara felt her attention sharpen in that particular way it did when something she'd thought she understood revealed a new surface. He opened the box, lifted out the map. But underneath the map in the bottom of the box was something else, a folded letter smaller than the map, the paper darker with age. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it carefully, the paper almost translucent with age, and read. It was a letter, written in the same precise small hand as the survey notes on the map. Dated 1871, 8 years after the survey, and 4 years before Henry Whitaker's death by the dates James had mentioned. She read it slowly. The rain drove against the rock above them. When she finished, she held it for a moment without speaking. "James," she said. "Yes." "Your grandfather knew," she said. "He knew about Roy Hatch's father. He knew about the pressure the Hatch family was putting on the smaller landowners in the North County. He documented it." She looked up. "This letter names names. It names Judge Patterson's father as being involved in an arrangement with Hatch's father to misfile boundary claims." James held her gaze steadily. "I know," he said. "This isn't just about your north section," she said slowly. "This is about a pattern, a decades-long pattern of—" She stopped. "James, if this letter reaches the right person in Hartwell, this isn't just Roy Hatch losing a land claim. This is Roy Hatch's entire operation coming under scrutiny." "I know," he said again. "Is that why you've been careful?" "For 6.5 years, the worn boots, the quiet, the staying invisible, you weren't just protecting the ranch from people who wanted your money." She felt the pieces clicking into place with the force of something that had been in front of her and not assembled. "You were waiting until you had everything you needed, until the time was right to do something larger than just protect what your grandfather left you." James was quiet for a long moment. The rain poured down. "My grandfather spent the last 4 years of his life trying to figure out how to stop what the Hatch family was doing to people in that county," James said. "Small farmers, families who'd built something real and lost it to bad paperwork and worse judges. He never found the right moment. He died trying." He looked at the letter in Clara's hands. "I made him a promise at his grave, that I would find the moment." Clara looked at him. The man who had worn worn boots for 6 years and let a town call him nothing and fixed fences and left firewood in the dark and waited and waited and waited. "You've been building a case," she said. "I've been building a case," he said. She understood everything differently now. Not just James, the whole of it. The wooden box, the map, the letter, the careful obscurity, the 30-day deadline that Roy Hatch had delivered like a threat, but was actually, she now saw, a trigger. Roy Hatch had come out into the open. He had filed paperwork. He had put his name on a legal document that connected him to a land claim, and now James had 30 days not to defend himself, but to do what his grandfather had never been able to do. "Roy Hatch doesn't know about the letter," she said. "No," James said. "He knows about the map. He doesn't know about the letter." "Because if he knew, he would have moved faster," James said, "and less legally." Clara sat with that for a moment. With the understanding of a man who had been so careful for so long that even his vulnerability had been calculated. Even the moment he'd walked into Pete's store and put the box on the counter that had been calculated. He'd known Roy was watching. He'd known the timeline was closing. He'd chosen to move on his own terms, not Roy's. "The person in Hartwell," she said. "The one you're going to see. It's not just the county surveyor." "No," James said. "There's a federal land commissioner, appointed last year. New man not connected to the old county network." He paused. "His name is Arthur Webb. He's been looking for documentation of the kind of filing manipulation that my grandfather described. He's been looking for 2 years and hasn't found anything solid enough to act on." "Until now," Clara said. "Until now," James said. Clara folded the letter with the same care she'd used on the map and handed it back to him. He placed it in the box under the map, latched it, and held it against his side. She looked at him. This man, this whole and complicated and entirely unsimple man, and felt something shift in her that was larger than the previous shifts, something foundational. "Why did you tell me this?" she said. "All of it. The letter, Webb, all of it. You didn't have to." James looked at the rain. "No," he said. "I didn't have to." "Then why?" He turned to look at her, and for once, the depth behind his eyes was entirely on the surface, and what it said was something that didn't need translation. "Because I am very tired," he said quietly, "of carrying things alone." The rain drove on. Clara held his gaze and felt the full weight of what that sentence had cost a man like him to say. "You don't have to," she said. "Not today." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "Not today." They stood in the shelter of the rock, while the rain came down close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and neither of them moved away. Day 4 arrived sharp and clear, the rain having washed the world to a particular vividness. They broke camp before dawn again, and covered the last stretch to Hartwell by early afternoon, riding through the outskirts of a town considerably larger than Red Hollow, a working county seat with a courthouse and a land office, and a federal building at the center of it, and the permanent industrious noise of a place that took itself seriously. Mrs. Carmichael's nephew, a spare young man named Daniel, who had his aunt's iron composure, and her eyes met them at the livery. He'd received the telegram. He had a room arranged for Clara, and a room for James, and the information delivered with precise economy that Arthur Webb was in Hartwell, and had been informed through careful channels that someone was coming with documentation he'd been looking for. "Careful channels," James repeated. "What does that mean?" "It means," Daniel said, "that my aunt has connections that would surprise you, and that Arthur Webb knows you're here without Roy Hatch knowing that Webb knows." James looked at Daniel for a moment. "Your aunt is a remarkable woman." "She'd say she's a practical one," Daniel said with the ghost of something in his expression. "She'd also say they're the same thing." Clara felt the echo of her own conversation with James settle over that observation and didn't say anything. They left the horses with Daniel and walked to the federal building. Arthur Webb was not what Clara had expected. She'd built a picture from the abstract federal commissioner new appointment, looking for documentation, something formal and deliberate and official. Instead, Webb was a compact man in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of field work rather than office work, and eyes that moved the same way James's eyes moved, seeing more than they announced. He looked at James when they came in, then at Clara, then back at James. "You're Henry Whitaker's grandson," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," James said. "Henry Whitaker sent a letter to the territorial office in 1871, Webb said, documenting specific violations of the land filing process in his county. That letter was received logged and then went missing from the record. We found the log entry 6 months ago. The letter itself." He spread his hands. James reached into the wooden box. He put the letter on Webb's desk. Webb looked at it. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way Clara had looked at it, like a man who is making sure he's seeing what he thinks he's seeing before he allows himself to react to it. Then he picked it up and read it. The room was very quiet. Clara watched Webb's face as he read. She watched the moment the careful official neutrality gave way to something more alive. Not excitement, but the focused intensity of a man who has been looking for a specific piece and has just found it. He finished, set it down, looked at James. "How long have you had this?" he said. "Since my grandfather died," James said. 1875. 17 years, Webb said. "He made me promise to wait for the right moment," James said. "Not the first opportunity, the right moment." He held Webb's gaze. "Roy Hatch filed a competing land claim last week through Judge Patterson. Roy Hatch's father and Judge Patterson's father are both named in that letter. Roy Hatch does not know the letter exists." Webb looked at the letter again, then back at James. "If I act on this," he said carefully, "I need the original survey documentation as well, notarized, filed properly. The land claim is what opens the door to a formal investigation. Without it, the letter alone is historical. Interesting, but not actionable." James put the map on the desk beside the letter. Webb looked at both of them. "I'll need the rest of today," he said, "and I'll need you both available tomorrow morning." "We'll be available," James said. "There's something else," Webb said. He leaned back slightly in his chair, and his expression shifted into something more careful. "Roy Hatch has a man in this office." The room got very still. "I don't know who," Webb continued. "I've suspected it for 8 months. I've been careful about what documentation passes through standard channels." He looked at James levelly. "Which is why I need to ask you how many people know you came to Hartwell," James thought. "Frank Harrison, Pete Alderman, Mrs. Carmichael who contacted your Daniel." He paused. "And the 4 people on the mountain." "Pete Alderman," Webb said. "Tom Hendricks, Mrs. Carmichael." He nodded slowly. "I know of all 3. Good people." He looked at Clara. "And you?" "Clara Bennett," she said. "I'm a schoolteacher from Red Hollow." Webb studied her for a moment. "You read the survey documentation." "My father was a surveyor, yes." "And you read the letter?" "Yes." I was quiet for a moment. "Then you understand what we're dealing with?" "I understand," she said, "that if the wrong person in this office knows James is here before you've had time to secure the documentation, Roy Hatch will know within hours, and whatever he has planned will move up." Webb nodded. "Yes." He looked at James. "Don't go to the land office today. Don't speak to anyone in this building other than me. Go back to wherever you're staying and wait." James started to say something. "I know," Webb said, preempting it. "You've been waiting for a long time. Wait one more day." A beat. James nodded. They left the federal building and walked back through Hartwell's busy streets, and Clara felt the tension in the space beside her. James moving with the controlled stillness of a man who is holding something very tightly and being very careful not to grip so hard it breaks. "One more day," she said. 17 years, he said quietly, "and one more day." She didn't say anything to that. There was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish it. They had supper with Daniel, who was sparse with conversation, but kept their cups full and their plates filled, which was its own form of hospitality. After the meal, Daniel excused himself and left them at the table, and for a while they sat with the remnants of the meal between them and the particular weight of a day that had been too large to digest quickly. It was James who finally spoke. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "When this is over," he said. He stopped, started again. "When the documentation is filed, and Webb has what he needs, and Roy Hatch is handled." He looked at his hands on the table. "I have to go back to the ranch." "Yes," she said. "Not back to Red Hollow the same way," he said. "Not to the cabin, not to the worn boots and the quiet and the—" He exhaled. "That chapter is finished. After tomorrow there's no more reason for it." Clara understood what he was really saying, and what he was really asking, and she felt the weight of it settle on her with the full force of something that had been building since the moment she'd turned from a bolt of cloth in Pete's general store and really looked at him for the first time. "What are you asking me?" she said. James lifted his eyes from his hands and looked at her directly, with the same unwavering steadiness she'd come to understand was not blankness, but depth. "I'm not asking you anything," he said. "I'm telling you what's true, because you told me on the mountain that you deserve the credit of your own choices, and you can only choose if you have the truth." Clara was quiet for a moment. "The truth," she said. "The ranch is real," he said. "What I told you on the mountain, all of it is real, but it means something different now than it did when I was 22 and inheriting something I hadn't built. I've spent 17 years understanding what it means to build something, what it costs and what it's worth, and what kind of person you want beside you when you're doing it." He paused. "I'm not talking about the land." The quiet between them was enormous and entirely full. "James," she said. "Yes. You told me in Red Hollow that you wanted someone who would choose you before your wealth." She held his gaze. "I came on this journey before I knew about the letter, before I knew the full scope of what you were carrying. I came because of what Tom Hendricks told me about the firewood, because of what Pete said about you never asking for anything, because of the way you looked when you put that box on the counter, not desperate, not performing. Just decided." She took a breath. "I'm telling you this so that you know. My reasons for being here are not your ranch." James held her gaze for a long, unguarded moment. "I know," he said, and his voice quiet as it was carried everything. The next morning arrived with the particular clarity that followed rain and hard travel and nights of insufficient sleep, the kind of clarity where everything feels both raw and precise. Webb had sent a message through Daniel at first light. 9 o'clock. Federal Building. Come in through the side entrance. They went. Webb was not alone when they arrived. Beside him was a man Clara didn't recognize, older, with the formal bearing of someone accustomed to significant rooms, and a leather document case on the table in front of him. "This is Commissioner Hayes," Webb said. "Federal Land Commission. I reached him by telegraph last night. He came on the first train." Clara felt James go very still beside her. Commissioner Hayes looked at James with the assessing attention of a man who had learned to make accurate judgments quickly. "Your grandfather wrote to us in 1871, he said. "The letter went missing from our files. We knew it had been filed and then made to disappear. We've spent years looking for the original." He paused. "I came personally because I've been waiting for what you're about to hand me for a very long time." James opened the wooden box. He placed the map and the letter on the table. Hayes looked at them. He picked up the letter with hands that were not entirely steady, and Clara thought, this man is moved and has been waiting for this and is not trying to hide either of those things. He read. He set it down. "The registration number on the survey," Clara said, because Webb and Hayes both looked up at her, and she realized she'd spoken without deciding to. Cross-referenced with the 1863 Territorial Registry, it establishes unambiguous prior claim to the full Whitaker acreage, including the north section. Roy Hatch's competing claim cannot stand against a properly documented prior survey with a verified registration number. Hayes looked at her. "You read survey documents." "My father was a surveyor," she said, "and I have had the last 4 days to become very familiar with this one." Hayes looked at James. "Who is she?" "Clara Bennett," James said. "She's a schoolteacher from Red Hollow." And then, with the quiet certainty of a man who has made a decision and is entirely at peace with it, "She's also the most important person in the room." Clara felt heat move through her face and was grateful for the cool of the room. Hayes looked between them. Then he looked back at the documents. "I'll need 3 hours," he said. "My legal clerk will prepare the formal registration. Once this is filed with our office, it supersedes the county filing, which means Roy Hatch's claim is not only invalid, but constitutes a knowing attempt to file a fraudulent competing claim against a documented prior title." "Which is a federal offense," Webb said. "Which is a federal offense," Hayes confirmed. He looked at James. "Your grandfather would be very proud," he said. James was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face, the kind of movement that happens when something you have carried for 17 years is finally irrevocably put down. "He was a stubborn man," James said. "He would mostly just be satisfied." Hayes almost smiled. "Those are usually the same thing," he said. The 3 hours that followed were the strangest of Clara's life. All the momentum, all the urgency, all the long, hard road of the last 4 days, and now the sudden suspension of waiting. While legal clerks worked in another room, and Webb kept the office door locked, and she and James sat in chairs on opposite sides of Webb's desk and waited. James sat with his hands flat on his thighs and his eyes on the middle distance, doing whatever it was he did when he was inside himself. Whatever long-practiced internal discipline had gotten him through 6.5 years of wearing someone he wasn't. Clara watched him and thought about what he'd said at the table the night before. Not talking about the land. She thought about Red Hollow. About Margaret, who had said don't take too long. About the school and the children who came without shoes, and the budget that never stretched quite far enough. She thought about a woman who had survived by thinking and planning and holding everything upright with both hands, and what it might mean to put something down. Not abandon it. Just share the weight of it. At one point, James looked at her across the desk. "You're thinking very loudly," he said. She surprised herself by laughing, a real laugh, brief and genuine, that she hadn't planned and couldn't have performed if she'd tried. "I've been told that before," she said. "Margaret says I think at people." "You do?" James said, and there was warmth in it, something completely unguarded. "It's not unpleasant." "High praise," she said. "From me," he said, "it is." She held his gaze. "James," she said. "Yes, after this is over, after the filing, after Roy Hatch is dealt with, after you go back to the ranch." She stopped. "Then, I would like to see it." He was very still. "The valley," she said. "The farmhouse. What your grandfather built." She held his gaze steadily. "I'd like to see all of it." Something opened in James Whitaker's face that she had not seen before, and suspected almost no one had seen in a very long time, something undefended and real, and quietly, profoundly glad. "Yes," he said simply. The door to the inner office opened. Webb came through it holding a document that bore 3 official seals and the weight of everything James's grandfather had started in 1863, and James had carried to its conclusion. "It's done," Webb said. "Filed, sealed, and copied to 3 separate federal offices simultaneously, so there is no single point of record that can be made to disappear." He set the document on the desk in front of James. "The Whitaker claim is established and irrefutable. Roy Hatch's competing filing will be formally rejected and the fraudulent nature of it referred for investigation." James looked at the document. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it the same way he'd looked at the wooden box that morning in December before he'd picked it up and carried it into Red Hollow and put it on a counter and changed everything. Then he picked it up. He held it for a moment. Then he set it down and looked at Clara. And what was in his face was not triumph. Not relief, though there was relief. Not vindication, though there was that too. What was in his face was the particular quiet expression of a man who has finished a very long journey and is looking at the person he wants to tell about it. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. 17 years. "Yes." He exhaled, long and slow and entirely genuine, and something in the set of his shoulders changed. Something that had been held through 6.5 years of careful, invisible living, through Roy Hatch on the ridge, and the hard ride, and the waiting room, and all of it, something released. Clara watched it happen, and she thought, this is the man nobody in Red Hollow ever saw. This is who has been standing at the edge of town in worn boots for 6 years, carrying a promise to a dead man and waiting for the right moment and doing it quietly and doing it alone. The thought tightened her chest in a way she didn't try to analyze. She just held it. Webb was speaking again. Procedural matters. Next steps for the investigation, timelines for the Hatch referral. James answered him with the clear, direct attention he brought to everything. Clara listened and added once a clarification about the registration notation that Webb confirmed was correct and made a note of. And when it was finally entirely completely finished, when they stood outside the federal building in the clear Colorado afternoon, with the document folded inside the wooden box and the box under James's arm, James stopped on the steps and turned to her. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't," she said. "I do," he said. "Not the practical things, reading the documents, knowing what to look for. More than that." He looked at her with the full, unguarded steadiness she had stopped finding difficult to meet. "You believed what was real before you had proof of it. That's not a small thing." Clara thought about what he'd said in the rain under the rock, that he was tired of carrying things alone. "It wasn't hard," she said honestly. "Once I actually looked." "That's the thing about looking," he said quietly. "It changes everything." She held his gaze. Yes, she said. "It does." Behind them, Hartwell moved and worked and went about its business, the ordinary machinery of a county seat on an ordinary afternoon, entirely unaware that the man standing on the federal building steps had just put down something he'd been carrying for 17 years. And the woman beside him, who had spent her own years being the practical one, the responsible one, the one who thought and managed and held everything upright. She felt standing there in the December afternoon, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Light, not in a way she could explain easily or would have tried to explain to anyone who asked. Just the particular lightness of a person who has been carrying something heavier than they realized and has discovered unexpectedly in the most unlikely of places that they don't have to carry it the same way anymore. James shifted the wooden box under his arm. "We should start back," he said. "Yes," she said. "It's 4 days." "I know how far it is," she said. And for the first time since this whole extraordinary journey had begun, he smiled. Not the small, controlled, almost smile she'd seen once or twice. A real one, complete, unguarded, the kind of smile a face makes when it has forgotten to be careful. It changed his face entirely. Clara filed it away in the part of her that she trusted most. Not the calculating part, not the planning part, but the part that had stood at the top of a mountain ridge and for the first time in years had simply felt. 4 days, she said. "Let's go." And they walked down the steps of the federal building, into the clear Colorado afternoon, toward the livery, toward the horses, toward the long road back. Back to Red Hollow. Back to everything that was about to be different. The ride back to Red Hollow took 4 days, the same as the ride out, but it was not the same journey. Nothing about it was the same. On the way to Hartwell, they had ridden with urgency and uncertainty, and the particular tension of two people who were still figuring out what the other one was. On the way back, they rode with the wooden box secured behind James's saddle and the federal document sealed inside it. And the tension was a different kind entirely. Not the tension of not knowing, but the tension of knowing and not yet having said all of it. They stopped the first night at the way station, where the taciturn man named Cole ran his tight no-questions operation. Cole looked at them when they came in, looked at the way they moved in relation to each other. That particular unconscious adjustment two people make when the space between them has changed its meaning and said nothing. Set 2 plates down, poured 2 coffees, went back to his business. Over supper, James told her about the ranch in the way he hadn't been able to before. Not the facts of it, which she'd seen with her own eyes from the ridge, but the feel of it. The way his grandfather had built the main barn first before the house, because Henry Whitaker believed you secured the animals before you secured yourself, and that this said something true about a person's priorities. The way the valley flooded in the spring thaw, briefly just enough to make the grass come in extraordinary in June. The man named George Aldine, who had managed it for 6 years and had, according to the last letter James had received, expanded the herd by 30 head, and hired 4 local men who'd been out of work since the Denison mill closed. Clara listened to all of it and ate her supper and watched his face while he talked. The opened, unguarded version of him that had started appearing after Hartwell and showed no sign of going back. "You love it," she said when he paused. He looked slightly surprised by the directness of it. "Yes," he said. "Not because it's worth something," she said. "Because it's real." He held her gaze. "Is there a difference?" "There's an enormous difference," she said. "Most people miss it." "My grandfather never missed it," James said. "He used to say that a man who loves land only for its value will always be poorer than a man who values it for what it grows." He paused. "I thought that was sentimental when I was young." "And now?" "Now I think it might be the most practical thing he ever said." Clara thought about that, and thought about a schoolhouse near the ranch that didn't exist yet, and children who might come to it from the surrounding land, and stopped herself from thinking too specifically, because she was not in the habit of building things in her mind before the ground was ready for them. But the thought was there. On the second day of riding back, they came to a stretch of trail where the view opened to the west, and you could see on a clear day the faint suggestion of Red Hollow in the distance, the thin line of smoke from its chimneys, the particular density of buildings on flat land. James reined in without warning and looked at it. Clara stopped beside him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "That it looks different from out here," he said. "Everything looks different from out here." "I know." He kept his eyes on the distant town. "I've been outside looking in for 6 years. I thought that was what gave me clarity. Standing apart watching, not being seen." He paused. "I'm realizing that wasn't clarity. It was just distance. They're not the same thing." Clara looked at the faint smudge of Red Hollow on the horizon. "No," she said quietly. "They're not." "What Roy Hatch said on the mountain," James said. "About everything being a performance. About my character being a costume." He turned to look at her. "Does any part of you wonder if he was right?" The question was genuine. She could hear the specific quality of it, a man not fishing for reassurance, but asking a real thing, because he trusted her to give him a real answer. She thought about it honestly before she spoke. "No," she said. "And here's why. A performance is exhausting. It requires constant maintenance. The people who knew you before. Red Hollow, Frank Harrison, George Aldine, the Harrisons. They speak to you like you're exactly who they've always known. There's no adjustment when they see you. No recalibration." She held his gaze. "A man maintaining a costume for 12 years would show the seams. You don't have any seams, James. What you have is a man who chose one true thing, simplicity, to protect himself from people who only wanted another true thing, his wealth." She paused. "Those are different decisions. Neither one is a lie." He looked at her for a long, steady moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since the mountain," she said honestly. And I think you're the most honest person I've met in Red Hollow," she said. "Which is uncomfortable to admit, given that I've spent 3 years thinking I was pretty good at reading people." Something moved in his face, warm, unguarded. "You are good at reading people." "I missed you entirely." "I was working very hard to be missed," he said. "Give yourself the credit." She almost smiled. "That's very gracious of you." "I'm a gracious man," he said without any irony at all. And this time she did smile, and he saw it, and the expression that crossed his face in response to it was something she decided to remember precisely and keep. They rode on. The third night they camped at the base of the mountain trail, rather than push through in the dark, building a small fire that was more about company than warmth. Frank Harrison's wife had packed provisions for the return that they hadn't discovered until the second day. More cornbread, dried beef. A small jar of something that turned out to be apple butter, which seemed so unexpectedly tender in the context of everything else that Clara had to look away from it for a moment. They sat across the fire from each other, and the conversation moved through things that were not the large things: his grandfather's stories about the early survey work, her father's particular methods for marking boundary lines in difficult terrain, Terrain the fact that Tom Hendricks had apparently been trying to get work on a decent ranch for 2 years and had been turned down everywhere because he was young and hadn't yet learned to make himself look like what people expected. "You should hire him," Clara said. James looked at her across the fire. "You think so?" "He's loyal," she said. "He's perceptive. He noticed things about you that grown men in that town missed. And he showed up at Pete's store before dawn on a cold December morning, because a man he barely knew asked him to come." She paused. "That's the kind of person you build things with." James was quiet for a moment. "George will need help in the spring. Expansion requires more hands than we currently have." "Then there's your answer." He studied her. "You're going to be very opinionated about the ranch." "I'm opinionated about most things," she said. "You knew that by the end of day one." "I did," he said. "I didn't mind it then either." The fire crackled between them. Above them, the Colorado sky was enormous and clear and made Red Hollow feel both very far away and very close. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "When we get back," he said and stopped. And started again with the particular careful deliberateness of a man who has decided to stop being careful about this specific thing. "I told you in Hartwell that I'm not going back to the cabin. Not going back to Invisible." He held her gaze. "I meant it. Whatever happens with Red Hollow, the town, knowing the ranch being known, Roy Hatch, and the investigation and all of it, I'm going back as myself. Not as the poor cowboy. As James Whitaker." He paused. "And I want to know if you'll let me court you. Properly. In the open. Not as a secret, and not as something decided on a mountain or in a federal building. As a man asking a woman honestly with full knowledge of who he is and what he's asking." The fire crackled. An ember popped. Clara looked at him across it for a long moment. She thought about what she was. A schoolteacher with a tight budget and a younger sister and 3 years of a life built in a small town that had just turned over everything she thought she knew about it. A woman who had survived by thinking rather than feeling, and was only now at 27 beginning to understand that the thinking and the feeling were not in fact opposites. She thought about what he was. A man who had worn boots for 6 years to find out if he was worth seeing. A man who had left firewood in the dark and fixed fences without pay, and waited 17 years to finish something his grandfather started. A man who had carried a secret long enough that telling it had cost him something real, and who had looked across a room full of people who dismissed him and found her. She thought about all of it. Then she said, "James, I rode 4 days to Hartwell with you in December, on trails I'd never traveled for a legal dispute that was not mine." She held his gaze. "I think the answer was already yes before you asked the question." He held her gaze. "I wanted to ask properly," he said. "I know," she said. "That's one of the things about you." "What is?" "That you do things properly," she said. "Even when they're already decided. You do them right." The fire burned between them. "Yes," he said quietly. "I try to." They rode into Red Hollow on a Thursday morning 9 days after they had left. They came in on the main road, not the back trail, not the quiet way that would have let them arrive unnoticed. James rode straight up Main Street at a pace that was not rushed, but was not hiding anything either. Clara rode beside him. The wooden box was tied to his saddle. His coat was the same old coat. His boots were the same worn boots. But something about the way he sat the horse was entirely different from every other morning he had ever ridden through Red Hollow. He looked like himself. The first person to see them was young Tom Hendricks, who was loading something onto a cart outside Pete's store, and looked up and saw them coming and stood up so fast he knocked the cart sideways. "They're back," Tom said to no one in particular, and then louder because he was 20 years old and had limited impulse control. "They're back." Pete Alderman came out of the store. Mrs. Carmichael appeared from somewhere, shawl and composure intact, as though she had been expecting them at this precise moment and had simply been waiting. 3 or 4 other townspeople stopped on the street. James reined in front of Pete's store and swung down from the horse. He looked at Pete. "It's done," he said. "Filed and sealed with the Federal Land Commissioner. Roy Hatch's competing claim has been formally rejected and referred for investigation." Pete Alderman let out a long breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "Thank God," he said simply. "Is that all it was?" Tom said, staring at them with an expression that said he had been carrying 9 days of suspense and was now trying to release it all at once. "Did something happen? Are you both is everything?" "We're fine, Tom," Clara said. She looked at him steadily. "James has something to ask you when there's a moment." Tom looked at James. James looked at Tom with the measuring attention he brought to things he was serious about. "I'll need good men in the spring," he said. "Men who show up when it matters. Pete and Frank Harrison can tell you the rest." Tom's face went through approximately 4 emotions in 2 seconds. "Yes," he said before any of them had finished resolving. "Yes, absolutely yes." James nodded. "We'll talk properly." Mrs. Carmichael stepped forward. "My nephew says you handled everything with considerable efficiency," she said to Clara. "He also says you were invaluable in the document review." "Your nephew is very kind," Clara said. "My nephew is very accurate," Mrs. Carmichael said precisely. "He doesn't do kind as a substitute for accurate." And then, with the briefest, most controlled version of a smile Clara had ever seen on a human face, "Well done." From Mrs. Carmichael, Clara understood that was everything. The news moved through Red Hollow. The way news moved through small towns, faster than seemed physically possible, through channels that defied any rational accounting. By afternoon, everyone knew. Not the complete truth, yet the full story of James's grandfather. The letter, Arthur Webb, the 17 years that would come out over days and weeks, in the way complicated truths always emerged in layers. But the essential shape of it landed on the town by nightfall. James Whitaker was not who they thought he was. James Whitaker owned the Whitaker Ranch and had for years. The poor cowboy at the edge of town had been carrying more than any of them had imagined, while they were busy not imagining anything about him at all. The reactions were exactly what you might expect from a small town, confronted with its own blind spots, a mixture of shame and defensiveness and genuine surprise. And in some cases, the particular meanness of people who cannot tolerate being wrong and choose to respond to it by being loud. Roy Hatch's name was attached to none of this yet, but the shadow of what was coming was already there, and people who had done business with Roy Hatch in ways they weren't proud of were having quiet private reckonings that showed on their faces in the general store and at the post office and over supper tables that night. James, for his part, moved through all of it with the same steadiness he had brought to 6.5 years of being nobody. The people who approached him with apologies, he accepted simply without theater. The people who didn't approach him, he didn't pursue. He was not performing forgiveness, and he was not performing indifference. He was just being exactly who he had always been in the open, where everyone could finally see it. Clara watched this from the appropriate distance of a woman who was not yet publicly attached to the situation, which was a distance that felt simultaneously correct and increasingly difficult to maintain. Margaret. When Clara came home that first evening, took one look at her and said, "Tell me everything," Clara told her. All of it. Including the parts she'd kept private the first time. Including what James had said across the fire on the last night of the ride back. Including the yes that had been yes before he asked. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, Margaret was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "I knew it from the firewood story." Clara stared at her. "You knew what from the firewood story?" "That he was someone worth being found," Margaret said simply. "The question was always whether you were going to look." She tilted her head in the infuriating way she had that was exactly like looking in a mirror. "You looked." "I looked," Clara agreed. Margaret smiled. "Good," she said. "Now eat something. You look like you've been traveling for 9 days." "I have been traveling for 9 days." "Then eat something," Margaret said, and put a plate in front of her, and that was that. 2 weeks after they returned to Red Hollow, on a cold but clear Saturday morning, James Whitaker knocked on Clara Bennett's front door. He was not wearing his old coat. He was not wearing his worn boots. He looked exactly like what he was, a man of substance and character, who had chosen to carry himself plainly, not from poverty, but from principle. And Clara opened the door and looked at him, and thought not for the first time, but with a new clarity. This is the man who was standing there the whole time. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He held out a folded document. She took it, unfolded it. It was a deed, a registered deed for 4 acres of land adjacent to the north end of the Whitaker Ranch at the edge of the valley she had seen from the ridge on that December morning that had changed everything. She looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" she said. "It's the site," he said, "for the school." Clara held the deed. She looked at it for a long time. "James," she said. "You mentioned it to Margaret," he said. "She mentioned it to Pete. Pete mentioned it to me." A pause. "Small towns." "Small towns," she agreed a little unsteadily. "There are families in the valley who've been working the land for a generation without access to proper education for their children," he said. "George has been telling me for 2 years that it's the thing most needed. I had the land. I just needed—" He stopped. "I need a teacher." She looked at him. "You need a teacher," she said. "A specific one," he said. "If she's willing." Clara held the deed. She thought about the children in Red Hollow who came to school without shoes. She thought about the Valley Green in June, with its strong barns and healthy land, and the families who worked it, and the children who would grow up there without anywhere to go to learn. She thought about a life that was bigger than a tight budget, in a drafty house, in a town where she'd been the responsible one for 3 years, without ever quite asking herself what she was being responsible toward. She thought about a man who left firewood in the dark and asked for nothing, who had worn boots to find out if he was worth seeing, who had looked across a room full of people who dismissed him and found her. She folded the deed carefully. She held it against her chest. "I'll need to finish the school year in Red Hollow," she said. "I won't leave mid-year. The children." "June," he said immediately. "George is planning the foundation for spring. It won't be ready before summer anyway." She looked at him. "And Margaret," she said. "There's a house on the east side of the valley," he said. 2 rooms. It needs work, but the structure is sound. It's hers if she wants it." Clara absorbed this. "You've thought about all of it," she said. "I've had 9 days of writing to think," he said, "and 17 years of practice at planning carefully." She held his gaze. "James Whitaker," she said. "Yes. You are the most thoroughly prepared man I have ever met." "Is that a yes?" he said, and his voice was quiet and careful, and entirely, completely, genuinely uncertain in a way that was the most human she'd ever heard him. She felt everything she'd been carrying 3 years of tight budgets, and holding everything upright, and being the responsible one, and never quite looking at the things she was walking past, she felt it shift. Not disappear. Not dissolve into something easy. Just find a different arrangement. A more sustainable one. She had survived by thinking, but she had come alive in the last 9 days by feeling. "Yes," she said. "It's a yes." James exhaled. One long, quiet breath. Then he smiled, the real one. The complete and unguarded one she'd first seen on the steps of the federal building, and she thought again, as she had then, that it changed his face entirely. Made it younger and older at the same time. Made it the face of a man who had waited a long time for something worth waiting for, and had turned out to be right to wait. "June," he said. "June," she agreed. What happened after that? What happened over the weeks and months that followed was not a small thing, though. It arrived in ordinary increments, the way important things usually do. Roy Hatch's investigation moved through the federal system with the slow, thorough inevitability of processes that have been properly documented and are driven by a commissioner who has been waiting 2 years to act. The details came out steadily. The Hatch family's long manipulation of county land records. The arrangements with judges. The smaller farmers who had lost land to bad paperwork and were with the documentation James's grandfather had left, able to begin the process of reclaiming what had been taken. Judge Patterson resigned quietly before the investigation formally named him. Briggs Roy's permanent shadow turned out to have a history of similar work in 2 other counties under a different name, which added considerably to the federal case. Roy Hatch himself, in the end, did not fight it. He sold his property at a significant loss to a family from the eastern counties who had no connection to anything that had come before and left Red Hollow without a word to anyone. Some people said he'd gone to Denver. Some said further west. Pete Alderman, who kept the most accurate records in the county, said simply that some men spend their whole lives building something on a foundation they don't own. And when the foundation goes, there's nothing left to take with them. James asked once by Tom Hendricks what he felt about it. About Roy Hatch leaving the way he did, without confrontation, without accounting, said that he felt nothing in particular. That what Roy Hatch did with the rest of his life was Roy Hatch's business. That his own business was the valley and the people in it, and the spring work that George Aldine had laid out, and the foundation going in for the school on the North Acres. Tom Hendricks started working the ranch in March. Within 6 weeks, George Aldine told James that the boy worked like he was trying to make up for something, and that whatever it was, the ranch was benefiting considerably from it. James told Tom what George had said, and Tom Hendricks, 20 years old, and not yet good at hiding things, had to look at a fence post for a moment before he could answer. "I'm not making up for anything," Tom said to the fence post. "I know," James said. "You showed up. That was enough." Tom looked at him. "My dad always said you were a good man," he said. "Even when everyone else was saying whatever they were saying. He said there was something there." James was quiet for a moment. "Your father's a smart man," he said. "He'd like to hear that from you," Tom said. "Then I'll tell him," James said. And he did. Margaret moved to the Valley House in May, 3 weeks before the school year ended, to begin making the place livable. She went with the focused enthusiasm of a young woman who had been told for 3 years by a sister who loved her fiercely and managed her carefully what she could and couldn't handle, and who was discovering in her own East Valley house with its 2 rooms and its structural soundness and its need for work that she could handle considerably more than anyone had accounted for. She sent Clara letters. The letters were detailed and cheerful, and occasionally reported developments. A neighbor family, 2 miles east with 4 children, who had asked already about the school, a creek behind the property that was perfect for something she wasn't sure what yet, a sunset she'd seen from the porch that she wanted Clara to see. Clara read the letters at her kitchen table in Red Hollow and felt the last weeks of the school year moving toward her like a tide coming in, bringing with it everything that was on the other side of it. She was not afraid. She was, and this was the surprising thing, the thing she hadn't expected and wouldn't have predicted in December when she'd been a woman who survived by planning. She was ready. The last day of the Red Hollow school year was a Friday in early June. Clara dismissed her class with the particular care she gave to endings, not abruptly, not without ceremony, because endings deserve to be marked, and children especially deserve to know when something real was concluding and something new was beginning. She told them she was going to be teaching at a new school in the valley. She told them she loved teaching them. She told them that everything they'd learned was theirs permanently, and that no one could take it from them, and that this was the particular power of education that made it worth fighting for, even when the budget was tight, and the roof needed fixing, and the boots didn't fit. Several of them cried. One boy, Frederick, the one who had drawn something inappropriate on his slate, cried the hardest, which surprised Clara until she thought about it and realized it didn't surprise her at all. She walked home for the last time through Red Hollow and stopped at Pete's store. Pete was behind the counter. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her for a moment. "Is this a supply run," he said, "or a goodbye?" "Both," she said. He came around the counter and shook her hand with the solemnity of a man who did not hug people but wanted to convey the equivalent. "You're a good teacher," he said. "Those children were lucky." "I was lucky," she said honestly. "They taught me more than I taught them." Pete studied her. "He's a good man," he said. "I should have seen it sooner." "We all should have," she said. "We didn't look." Pete nodded slowly. "We didn't look." He agreed with the weight of a man taking on his share of an accounting. "Don't let that happen again out there." "I won't," she said. "I promise." She shook his hand again. She walked out. James was waiting with the horses at the edge of town, where the road turned toward the mountains. He was wearing a coat she hadn't seen before, not fancy, Not the dressed-up version of wealth that some men used to announce themselves, but a good coat, well made, the coat of a man who had stopped needing to pretend in either direction. He saw her coming and watched her walk toward him with the full, steady attention he brought to things he intended to keep. She reached him. She looked at him. "Ready," he said. She thought about Red Hollow behind her, the drafty house, the tight budget, the 3 years of holding everything upright by herself. She thought about what lay ahead, the valley, the school foundation going in on the North Acres. Margaret in her East Valley house, discovering what she could handle. Tom Hendricks working a fence line with something to prove, George Aldine expanding a herd. Frank Harrison shaking a man's shoulder because some things didn't need words. She thought about a wooden box on a general store counter and a man who had looked across a room full of people who couldn't see him and found the one person who, if she'd only actually looked, would have seen him the whole time. "Yes," she said. And she meant it with every part of herself, the careful thinking, planning part, and the part that had learned in 9 days of December, riding to simply feel. James held her gaze. Then he handed her the reins of her horse and swung up onto his own, and they rode out of Red Hollow together into the morning toward the valley, toward the life that had been waiting patiently, faithfully, like the man himself, for someone to finally look at it and see what was really there. Behind them, Red Hollow went on as small towns do, imperfectly, stubbornly, slowly learning, as all of us do, that the most valuable things in the world rarely arrive announced. They arrive quietly, in worn boots, carrying a wooden box, waiting for someone brave enough to look.